Hey there. We are kicking off a new series here. We're calling it An Arm and a Leg 101. You know, we have spent years reporting on two huge questions. Why does healthcare cost so freaking much? And what can we maybe do about it? And we've been chasing answers one story, one question at a time. And now we're pulling together some of what we've learned, digging a little deeper, going a little broader. Starting with why so many drugs cost so much. You know, one of the first questions I ever asked here, one of our first stories, was how can insulin be so expensive? Like, wasn't it discovered in the early 20th century? Shouldn't it be a generic drug by now? You know, cheap? And part of the answer I got was insulin has been transformed since the early 20th century. A medical researcher named Jing Luo told me today's insulins are a long way from what we had 100 years ago.
They've been really modified at a molecular level. It's cool stuff. It's super cool stuff. And, there are multiple Nobel Prizes in physiology and medicine that have made this happen.
And all that super cool stuff, those amazing discoveries, got patented, meaning the patent holders, the pharma companies, got a monopoly on those amazing discoveries. And the pharma companies also claimed patents and monopolies on a bunch of other things. Not all of them amazing, but each new patent can mean another delay for a generic version coming to market.
Companies can stack dozens of patents on top of each other to try to thwart generic competition. Because they can say, look, we've got 3 patents on the active ingredient. We've got patents on the medical uses of the active ingredient. We've got patents on the non-active excipient associated with this ingredient. And so you who are trying to enter this space, will sue you for patent infringement on all of them.
A patent guarantees you at least a 20-year monopoly, and drugs can generally get an extra 5. And these extra patents, secondary patents, can keep you protected longer if you don't file them at the same time as the original. So, to talk about a drug that's in the news right now, the original patent on the active ingredient in Wegovy and Ozempic actually expired this year. The extra 5 years will extend that to the early 2030s. But dozens of extra patents, secondary patents, filed later, they mean that here in the US, we might not see cheaper generic versions until 2042 or later. And as Jing Luo told me, this strategy isn't a secret. It's an industry cornerstone.
When you listen to these CEOs of pharma companies being interviewed at CNBC, they'll be like, well, what about generic competition for this product? And they'll just keep saying, no, we've got this really robust patent portfolio. We can withstand any challenge. We're going to tie this up in courts forever. And don't worry about it. We're going to continue this gravy boat for a long, long time. That's the way they reinsure investors.
A robust patent portfolio, or what researchers and advocates call a patent thicket. And they say quality on these patents matters less than quantity. And the numbers are wild. According to one study, the 10 best-selling drugs for 2021, including drugs for cancer, for HIV, for arthritis, those 10 drugs were protected by a combined total of 742 patents, with hundreds more pending. Now, when these add-on patents get challenged in court, they actually get tossed out more often than primary patents. But lawsuits cost money. A robust patent portfolio, a patent thicket, means generic companies would need to be ready to file a lot of them. So we wanted to know, how did all this happen? How did these games get started? And it turns out there is one guy who can tell you the story from the beginning, for better and for worse, who helped shape it, who made millions of dollars from it and saw its flaws, and has spent most of the last 30 years trying to fix them. He's a lawyer named Al Engelberg, and he's 86 years old.
I tell people all the time, I live in a pharma world, where half the people think I'm dead and the other half wish I was.
Al Engelberg's story is the story of generic drugs in America, and it's a wild ride. This is An Arm and a Leg, a show about why healthcare costs so freaking much and what we can maybe do about it. I'm Dan Weissman, I'm a reporter, and I like a challenge. So, the job we've chosen here is to take one of the most enraging, terrifying, depressing parts of American life and bring you something entertaining, empowering, and useful. Al Engelberg's parents fled Nazi Germany in the late 1930s. He was born here, less than a year after they arrived. They had nothing. And here's where they made their new life.
We are flying over a well-known eastern city that is remarkable because manufacturing is almost non-existent. A city whose principal business is the entertainment of millions. Atlantic City, often called the vacation capital of the nation.
Al Engelberg likes to say he learned most of what he knows about practicing law on the Atlantic City boardwalk by the time he was 16.
We grew up very, very fast there. I started working when I was about 9 or 10, and there were lots of opportunities on the boardwalk.
His first job was crawling around under the boardwalk looking for loose change.
But I went on to work at hot dog stands and an illegal bingo game for the local mob.
And in every job, Atlantic City drove home its major lesson. Cheating. Hustling. That is something you've got to expect. So, at this illegal bingo parlor, Al's job was walking between tables, doling out bingo cards for a dime apiece. And the bosses hired college kids to walk behind kids like Al to keep them honest.
I mean, these guys are running an illegal game, but they still need to count, and they still inherently don't trust anybody.
Which was the right impulse. I mean, Al says the college kids had their own hustle. They'd have him set aside $1 or $2 before turning in his dimes and split that dollar with him 50-50, and then tell the bosses Al's count was fine.
And everybody knowing that the counts were wildly inaccurate anyway because the little old ladies were stealing cards. Everybody in the room had their own thing going, from the customers on.
After Al made it out of Atlantic City, his unique on-the-job education continued. He studied chemical engineering at Drexel, then took a job as a patent examiner while going to law school at night. And at that job, he learned the patent system was ripe for hustling, partly because most of his colleagues weren't necessarily giving the job their all. I mean, like him, most patent examiners were working their way through law school, and they were sneaking time to study on the job.
We used to be able to cut our notes down so they fit in these file drawers with the patents. And you would be reading your notes, and if your boss came by, he would just drop a patent on top of the notes.
I mean, you could say it was Atlantic City all over again. Everybody on the job is sneaking something for themselves. In this case, time. And Al Engelberg could also see that even if his colleagues gave it their all, most of them were too green to do their job well. I mean, a patent examiner's job, deciding whether a proposed invention deserves a monopoly, which at that time would be 17 years, that meant deciding whether the idea for that invention would be obvious to a, quote, person of ordinary skill in that field.
And most of the examiners had never worked in that field and had absolutely no idea. And this is the big leagues. You're granting somebody a monopoly for 17 years. And it seemed ridiculous on its face.
Al cut his own path at the patent office because he'd worked his way through engineering school in manufacturing plants. And there, he saw what people of ordinary skill in that field could do to solve problems every day. So he specialized in examining patents in fields he actually knew something about. That got him promoted, and then it got him recruited by a corporate lawyer. After the company paid his way through the rest of law school, he jumped to the Justice Department because he was ambitious. He wanted experience junior lawyers don't usually get, like trying cases of his own. After a few years of doing just that, he took a job with a small law firm in New York City in 1968.
I came to New York to private practice at the age of 30, and I was ready to go. I mean, I was ready to tear the world apart, and I did.
Patents were still a specialty. And in 1973, he got a call that led to his first generic drug case. Now, generic drugs were not a hot market at the time.
The generic drug industry in 1970s was essentially a half a dozen privately owned family businesses, mostly in the metropolitan New York area. And most of the drugs that they were selling were mostly drugs that were approved before 1962.
1962 is when the FDA made it harder to get a new drug approved. You had to go through long clinical trials to show that your drug was safe as well as effective. And you had to do that even if your drug was a generic copy of an existing drug. So those little companies, they didn't have the capital to run trials like that. So they were stuck selling those older drugs. Not much of a business. Maybe 20% of prescriptions were for generic drugs at that time. So when Al Engelberg got a call for his first generic drug case, that was the context. And the case itself did not sound promising. For one thing,
all the call wasn't even from the client, it was from a bank. The client was bankrupt.
The client was bankrupt. This bankrupt client, Primo Pharmaceuticals, was getting sued for patent infringement, and their bank was willing to put up $10,000 for a defense. Nowhere near enough to actually try a case. Oh, and then there was this.
From what they told me and the information they gave me, we didn't have a very good defense.
But Al Engelberg saw an opening because he could see his opponents had weaknesses too.
The patent owners were in a very strange position. If they won, they got nothing because we were already bankrupt. Two, they were going to have to spend the legal fees to win.
Win against a young lawyer named Al Engelberg, who already had a rep as a tough opponent. So they could lose.
And if they lost, they would lose millions and millions of dollars in business because there wouldn't be a patent and they'd have competition from generic drugs.
And meanwhile, Al Engelberg is also sizing up the judge. He knows this guy doesn't love patents. So Al shows up to the first conference and he bluffs.
I said to the judge, "Oh, Your Honor, it's another one of those patents. They're all invalid." And I said, "We don't need very much discovery. We'll be ready to go to trial in a few months. Just set a trial date."
And the other side walk out beside themselves. And within a couple of weeks, they call Al to say, hey, how about this? You guys just acknowledge our patent is okay, and we'll give you the money we would have spent litigating. Call it $400,000.
I called the client and said, "How's $400,000? He said, "Are you kidding?"
They didn't just get out of trouble. They got out of bankruptcy with $400,000 in their pockets because Al Engelberg knew how to size up a situation.
You don't learn that in law school. That's not what they teach.
Word gets around about that case. And pretty soon, Al says everybody in the generic drug world is calling him. It's a small world, but by the end of the 1970s, it looks like there may be room for it to start getting bigger. Because people are starting to notice. Drugs are expensive. Maybe there should be more cheap generics. So some generic drug companies form an association, start lobbying to make it easier to get generic drugs to market without having to go through all those expensive trials. Now, the brand name drug makers start pushing back. They say it takes so long to run those trials and get their drugs approved, they don't get enough time to make money before their patents expire. And in 1983, Democratic Representative Henry Waxman steps in to broker a compromise with help from Republican Senator Orrin Hatch. And Mr. Engelberg goes to Washington, running strategy for the generic drug makers.
In a lot of ways, that's where my Atlantic City training really helped me at the end of the day.
Because there were a lot of people with a lot of interests, a lot of angles. He starts commuting from New York to Washington, D.C. a couple times a week for months and months, more than a year. And Al Engelberg says, this time, it wasn't just about winning a case.
I was in the back of a cab, the way I remember it, with the senior partner of the law firm, and he says, "Why are you breaking your ass going to Washington 2 or 3 times? Why don't you send an associate? It's just it's just another case." And I said, "Are you kidding?" I said, "You know how many lawyers ever get to do what I'm doing right now? To be at the table influencing what may be a major law that's going to have major consequences is like something I never thought my whole life I'd be doing.
But a kid from Atlantic City turns out to be exactly the right person to try to balance all the angles, negotiate a compromise. It took more than a year, and it almost didn't happen. But then it did. Congress passed the bill, and President Ronald Reagan got in front of cameras to sign it.
Let me turn my attention to the real reason we're here this afternoon. Signing into law the Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act of 1984.
Better known ever since as Hatch-Waxman. Now, Hatch-Waxman had three basic components. One, brand drug makers got a few extra years on their patents. Two, generic drug makers got a quicker pathway to FDA approval. And three, the new law laid out rules for a generic drug maker when they wanted to challenge an existing patent. Negotiating that third part was where Al Engelberg's education on the Atlantic City boardwalk and the U.S. Patent Office and the generic drug industry came together. And the result would make him millions and millions of dollars. And it was going to blow a hole into the grand bargain he had worked so hard to bring about. That's coming right up. This episode of An Arm and a Leg is produced in partnership with KFF Health News. That's a nonprofit newsroom covering health issues in America. The folks at KFF Health News are amazing journalists. Their work wins all kinds of awards every year. We are honored to work with them. So, the brand name drug makers and the generic drug makers struck a deal. And that deal was good for both of them. Both sides got something out of it. And the public was supposed to get something out of it too. And to be fair, we did. Remember, back then, maybe 1 out of 5 prescriptions was for a generic drug. Now, it's 9 out of 10. But we pay more than ever for drugs, mostly for branded, patent-protected drugs. And the biggest, most important, most profitable drugs get locked behind patent thickets. How did that happen? Well, to understand that, it helps to know what Al Engelberg got out of the whole bargain. Al had been there at the bargaining table on behalf of the generics, and one day, during the negotiations, he was in the office with Henry Waxman's lead counsel, a guy named Bill Corr. When Corr got a call from somebody on the other side, Corr starts pointing at the phone, pointing to Al, indicating, this guy's talking about you. And when Corr gets off the phone, he says, that guy's not so sure about this deal where bad patents could get challenged because he's suspicious about where you might take this. Like, are you just going to set up a bounty hunting operation to get patents declared invalid? And Corr said, Al, I mean, would you do that?
And I said, Bill, until this moment, I've never given it any thought, but it's a hell of a good idea. Maybe I'll look at it.
And he did, starting almost as soon as Hatch-Waxman became law.
We sat in the Rose Garden, September 23rd, 1984, watched Reagan sign the bill. And in December of that year, I sat down at my kitchen table with a yellow pad, and I laid out a strategy.
If you were going to set up a bounty hunting operation, how would you do it? Al Engelberg knew a lot of patents were garbage, knew it from his time in the patent office, knew it from practicing law, and he knew how much money a successful patent challenge could be worth. And the way Hatch-Waxman worked, if a generic drug company challenged a patent and won, they would get 6 months before any other generic drug makers could get a crack at the market. So their only competition would be the brand. Say a pill costs 2 cents to make, and the brand is selling for $1 a pill. You're getting 98 cents of profit for every pill. Well, if you're the only competitor, you could charge 75 cents a pill and get 73 cents of profit. And on a hit drug, you could make millions and millions just in those 6 months. So Al's idea was this. Partner up with a generic drug maker. Go find cases, drugs with weak patents, win those cases, and split those millions in potential profits 50-50. Al pitched a generic drug maker. They were ready to go. And so he brought the deal to his law firm.
As it turned out, my partners weren't interested in having me do this. They tried to talk me out of it.
But they couldn't. So he left, went out on his own, all on his own.
And the truth is, I never hired a single soul, not even a secretary. And I couldn't type. I still can't type.
But he hunted and pecked his way through brief after brief. He bought an early portable computer. It weighed 30 pounds, and he lugged it around in the back of his car for 10 years.
It was stupid. I almost killed myself, but it worked out okay.
Yeah, turns out Al Engelberg was really good at finding the problems with drug patents. In one of his first cases, Al Engelberg personally made more than $70 million. Other cases settled. A few million here, a few million there. It adds up. And then
It got to be the mid-90s, and I was working on a case called Buspar.
the Buspar case ended up a big winner for Al Engelberg and his generic drug partners. But it had consequences that went way beyond a single case and led to big losses for the public. Here's how it started.
Buspar was an anti-anxiety drug, and by all accounts, not a very good one.
But Bristol Myers Squibb had invested big in advertising and marketing campaigns.
I feel anxious. I can't concentrate. I'm so irritable.
If you suffer from excessive worry, it can feel like a mountain of anxiety.
I'll never get it all done. I'm overwhelmed.
But a prescription medication called Buspar can help.
And all that marketing did its job. By the mid-1990s, Buspar was making more than $200 million a year for Bristol.
The only problem for them was that the drug was not new.
Yeah, the active ingredient was well known in medical literature as a tranquilizer, but nobody had bothered to market it. So Bristol Myers Squibb had filed a patent on it, claiming they discovered a new use for this well-known tranquilizer, treating anxiety. Al Engelberg says when he read that patent application, he could barely believe it. Like, what do tranquilizers do if not treat anxiety? It's like saying, there's a stuff called sugar. We're going to take out a patent on using it as a sweetener. This looked like a case for a guy from Atlantic City.
I did something that lawyers don't, and that's just the way I was built. I filed a motion with the court and basically said, we don't need any evidence. You just have to read the patent. If you believe it's true, the patent's invalid. Just, all you need is a dictionary, basically.
And Al says Bristol pretty soon was eager to settle.
We get into a settlement discussion, and we keep saying no, 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 no.
Because Al's partners had done the math, and they figured they stood to make $100 million or more once they won. So when the other side was offering $25 million, no was an easy answer.
We said, why are we going to take this? It's crazy. There's a reward here is we know what it is. We're going to get it eventually.
So Al sits down with a lawyer from the other side, a guy he knows, explains how he sees the math. And pretty soon, the other side comes through with a much bigger offer. $72 million, almost 3 times as much.
And I'm sitting there like, what are you, crazy? But then think about it from their point of view.
Paying $72 million is nothing compared to what Bristol stands to gain if this lawsuit goes away. With their monopoly, Bristol Myers Squibb is making more than $200 million a year on Buspar. And unless somebody else lines up to do what Al Engelberg had done, they can expect to keep that monopoly for years, charging whatever they want, $2 a pill, $3 a pill, which Al Engelberg says is exactly what happened. In fact, they kept that monopoly for like 5 years.
As it turned out, nobody came behind us. And so they had that monopoly until 2000. So they got 5 years of $2 billion in gross profits.
They made out.
For the cost of $75 million. And the only people that got screwed, the public got screwed because the public is continuing to pay, $2 a pill or $3 a pill for a drug that eventually ends up being available for 20 or 30 cents. So that's how it works.
That's how it works. The The branded company and the generic company both make out great. And cheaper generic versions of a drug get delayed. So that amazing payday for Al Engelberg and his partners at the generic drug company, it turned into a model, a template for the kind of deal that every generic drug company was going to want in on. That kind of deal got a nickname. They called it pay for delay.
That spread through the industry like wildfire. Those numbers, you don't make those numbers half a cent at a time on pills.
Lawsuits can be way more profitable. But Al Engelberg wouldn't be filing them. A year or so after the Buspar case settled and sparked the pay for delay gold rush, he retired. He had plenty of money and nothing to prove. And in retirement, he started evaluating what he'd accomplished, for better and for worse. For better, generic drugs had more than doubled their share of the market since Hatch-Waxman had taken effect, saving unbelievable amounts of money for people. For worse, he could see these two places where, despite all of his Atlantic City training, he'd missed a couple of angles in negotiating Hatch-Waxman. One was this whole pay-for-delay scheme. It turned out, in balancing incentives for brands and generic makers, he left open this perverse incentive that left the public out of the deal. And the second thing was a loophole that Hatch-Waxman had left open. So that law created a process where players like Al and his generic partners could challenge patents on drugs like Buspar, drugs they thought didn't deserve protected monopolies. Hatch-Waxman removed some friction for those attacks. The drug companies developed a way to add more friction, stacking extra patents, secondary patents, on every drug, developing patent thickets. And even if a secondary patent is trivial, and lots of them do get tossed out, challenging it means a court fight. And that costs money.
It caused the big drug companies to just get more and more patents. Because why not? There was nothing standing in the way.
I mean, nobody knows better than Al Engelberg. Patent examiners don't exactly stand in the way. And those two things, the patent thickets and the pay for delay, Al Engelberg says they fed on each other.
The economics of the business caused these kinds of settlements to reach epic proportions. So the generic companies would challenge these secondary patents, and the drug companies would pay them off.
In 1999, Al Engelberg published an article in a scholarly journal arguing that Hatch-Waxman needed a reboot. Even the 6-month head start for a successful challenge, he thought, could probably go. And ever since, for more than 25 years, he's poured millions of dollars into efforts to tighten the rules, funding research, funding a public information campaign from Consumer Reports, even a Center for IP Law at his alma mater, NYU. And it hasn't always gone his way. Pay for delay has gotten much bigger since Al Engelberg wrote his first article calling for reform. He wrote in 1999 that about 24 patent challenges had been filed. Now, he estimates that number at 12,000.
I can't tell you how many tens of billions of dollars in legal fees that is. It's one of the fastest growing and steadiest industries for big law.
A Hatch-Waxman litigation forum on LinkedIn has more than 14,000 members. And then there's this. Hatch-Waxman doesn't cover a lot of today's top-selling drugs, the biggest moneymakers. Those belong to a class called biologics. That class includes famously expensive rheumatoid arthritis drugs like Humira and Enbrel, and insulin. So biologics weren't a category 40 years ago when Hatch-Waxman got negotiated. Congress passed a new law to deal with them in 2010, the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act. Al Engelberg is not a fan of that law.
Whatever mistakes were made in Hatch-Waxman, they were multiplied by 10 and deliberately in the biologics law.
He says this law all but encourages patent thickets, and it doesn't provide a pathway to challenge them. He says it reminds him of some of his early days practicing law.
Back in the 70s, we used to have small startup clients in the computer field, and they would get letters from IBM. It says, we're writing to inform you that you may be infringing one or more of the following patents. And there was a 10-page list of patents attached. And the startup would come to us and say, what should we do? And and we would say, find another line of work. What are you going to do?
But Al Engelberg has not given up. In 2025, he published a book, Breaking the Medicine Monopolies. The book tells the story of his career, and it lays out his prescriptions for fixing the problems. And he doesn't just focus on plugging the holes in Hatch-Waxman and his biologics law.
We don't actually need a generic drug industry. We need generic drug pricing.
So he's got proposals for an increased government role in negotiating and regulating prices, and more than that. He argues that a 1980 law allows the government to commission generic versions of drugs that were developed using public research dollars. He also says the FDA rules that protect secondary patents on drugs that allow for a lot of patent thicketing are based on a completely wrong interpretation of Hatch-Waxman. And he tells us he's working up a challenge to those rules with help from AI tools like Claude. He's 86 years old, and he does not seem inclined to stop.
It so changed my life, and I did so well by it. And I thought, how can I not take on this problem? Who's going to do it if I don't do it?
He's got the time, money's no object, and he knows the territory as well as anybody. He helped create it.
So it's my obligation, really. It's that sort of Jewish guilt. What can I tell you? I'm paying back for the bingo game.
So, we've gone back more than 50 years on this question. Why aren't there more generic drugs? We've learned why we've got the ones we have and what stands in the way of getting more. And that is just in time, because this spring, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to hear arguments in a case that could restrict that generic drug pipeline even further. I mean, it could have major implications. And understanding what they are requires all of the 101 we've covered here. We'll have that story for you in a few weeks. Till then, take care of yourself. This episode of An Arm and a Leg was produced by Emily Pisacreta with help from me, Dan Weissman, and edited by Ellen Weiss. Adam Raimunda is our audio wizard. Our music is by Dave Weiner and Blue Dot Sessions. Claire Davenport is our engagement producer. Sarah Balama is our operations manager. Bea Bosco is our consulting director of operations. This series, An Arm and a Leg 101, is made possible in part by support from Arnold Ventures. An Arm and a Leg is produced in partnership with KFF Health News. That's a national newsroom producing in-depth journalism about health issues in America and a core program at KFF, an independent source of health policy research, polling, and journalism. Zach Dyer is senior audio producer at KFF Health News. He's editorial liaison to this show. An Arm and a Leg is distributed by KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. Thanks to the Institute for Nonprofit News for serving as our fiscal sponsor. They allow us to accept tax-exempt donations. You can learn more about INN at inn.org. Finally, thank you to everybody who supports this show financially. You can join in anytime at armandalegshow.com/support.